I want to look at two areas, and I'm sharing my 15-minute slot with a comrade from my constituency, Talal. I'm going to look at the Black Lives Matter movement very briefly and what it's opened up, and the legacy of imperialism and racism in the Labour Party. Now, the killing of George Floyd in those 8 minutes and 46 seconds and the rebirth of the Black Lives Matter movement has clearly reverberated around the world. And I don't need to tell you about all the protests and examples of issues and histories that have been thrown up by this movement. In Britain, the challenge to racism right now comes not from the left, and definitely not from the Labour Party, but I would argue from the Black-led BLM movement. And the response from our leadership has been derisory. Just a quick reminder, we know that our leader took the knee in his office, proclaiming that he and Angela Rayner kneel with those opposing anti-Black racism. As far as I know, no Labour Party officials have been suspended for the racism we saw exposed in the leaked report, or alleged racism, I should say. No clarity at all over our leader's position on BLM, just this ridiculous unconscious bias training, and no attempt to acknowledge how slavery has shaped modern Britain, from Oxford and Cambridge, the banks, the railways, insurance companies, Royal Mail, leading cultural institutions, wealthy families, our education system, and of course the legacy of racism, let alone any attempt to explore the legacy of racism in the Labour Party. Now, I'm not suggesting that our current leadership is the only, it's only now, I'm not suggesting that it's only our current leadership which has failed to do that. It's just that now is such an opportunity when BLM has created this climate in which all aspects of Britain's legacy of slavery and empire is up for discussion. You would think that somebody in the Labour Party would be prepared to lead on discussions of how the Labour Party has failed generations of Black people in Britain, in its ex-colonies and within its party. But almost nothing, well, very little. And you know, the point is, on a crude level, we ignore this unfolding movement at our peril. A reminder, and I'm using the language that is used when these reports come out. African, Caribbean, Asian and minority ethnic people in Britain have and still overwhelmingly vote Labour, but this can't be taken for granted. So in 1997, apparently, according to the Runnymede Trust, 80 to 90% of ethnic minorities voted Labour. In 2015 and 2017, that was 77%. And in 2019, it was 64%. 20% voted Tory, God knows why 12% voted Lib Dem. Now, clearly this is a simplistic overview, and I realise it doesn't take into account a whole range of things like gender and class and geography. But in the cities, we know that we need these votes and we cannot take them for granted. And the Labour Party cannot take its Black members for granted. Now, we hoped that the leadership under Jeremy Corbyn could change this, but we now know that some in the apparatus had absolutely no intention of challenging their own racism. I mean, you know, Dawn Butler says the Labour Party is an anti-racist party that has to prove it. And there is no doubt that many in our party are active anti-racists. However, the Labour Party isn't and hasn't been challenging racism in the way we would want. And I suggest we need to have that open and honest discussion about Labour's record on being the so-called anti-racist party. Now, just very briefly, I want to just cover a bit of history. My father came to Britain in 1943 to join the RAF. Only a handful of West Africans were actually allowed to come because there was a feeling that we didn't want to train them up in case they went back and started fighting for independence. And bear in mind, this was only 3 years after the colour bar in the armed forces was lifted, which actually allowed Black men to be officers. When he was demobbed, he joined the Communist Party and subsequently the Labour Party. But he always used to tell us, he always used to say to us, now just remember that your hero, Clem Attlee, was a hero. But when he formed the 45 Labour government, you know, and did amazing stuff, he was determined to hold on to the British Empire and the British Commonwealth. And it wasn't as crude as just holding on to the imperial glory following the struggles of war, but it was about ensuring that Britain maintained the political and economic advantages that it had gained through slavery and through imperialism. And, you know, even while recruiting people from the Caribbean to work in sectors like manufacturing, public transport and the NHS, there was opposition in the Labour Party. 2 days after the SS Windrush arrived at Tilbury, a group of Labour MPs wrote to Clem Attlee asking him to oppose mass immigration. And the Colonial Secretary, Creech Jones, who was, you know, a goody, a conchy during the First World War and everything, said, don't worry, they may have British passports, but they won't last the winter in England. When the tryst with destiny was redeemed and India gained independence, followed over the next 20 years by independence in various African countries, neocolonialism was born, and Nkrumah used that word. And Britain brutally opposed any challenges to its interests, and the Labour Party was in there as well. So, you know, look at Malaya, look at Aden, not to mention the ruthless support for business interests across the ex-colonies. In '69, Labour introduced the Commonwealth Immigration Act after East African Asians came to Britain. You know, you had to have a parent or grandparent born in the UK or who was a UK citizen. And let's face it, that certainly wasn't a huge problem for people from the ex-colonies like Australia and Canada. It was Blair it was under Blair that Labour opened the Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre in 2001. And of course, the awful and damaging and ridiculous PREVENT strategy leading to children in schools being surveilled and harassed. And I know about it because I was working in further education at the time. It was the High Court, not the Labour Party, that moved against Phil Woolas and his racist and anti-Islamic election campaign in 2010. And it was as recently as 2017 that Caroline Flint sympathised with her white constituents who'd seen their non-white population increase from 0.5% to 5% over 20 years. And, you know, some may dismiss these as isolated incidents, but it's not just what happens in the Labour Party, but do we actually believe that the Labour Party challenges the government when it's in power? It's not just what the Labour Party does. Where are the arguments about implementing the findings of endless reports on inequality? You know, more recently, the Lammy review into the criminal justice system, Baroness McGregor's review into race in the workplace, the hostile environment and the Windrush lessons learned. And 20 years after the murder, over 20 years after the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the Macpherson report, a black person is 10 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. Black people have considerably more poorer healthy outcomes, as COVID has shown. People of Bangladeshi ethnicity are twice as likely to die as white people. African, Caribbean, and Gypsy and Roma children are 4 times more likely to be excluded from school than other groups. And BAME households, again I use the terminology, are far more likely to live in overcrowded, inadequate and fuel-poor housing than whites. And part of me wants to apologise for repeating a lot of this, but it's when you sort of summarise it and we see the complete failure of Labour opposition to this, that we have to ask these questions. And let's face it, all the things that I've mentioned have got worse during the pandemic and will be considerably worse in the economic crisis that follows. So I suppose what I'm trying to stress is this: our party must win over the trust of black people by promoting diversity at all levels of the party and being seen to tackle racism and discrimination within the party. And we must be seen to be fighting for the rights of the black communities and the black communities that vote for us. And we need to be in solidarity with those challenging racism and the legacy of imperialism in British society, but not just here, internationally, and in the Labour Party and in the trade unions. And it's almost like this is gloom and doom, and that I haven't spent enough time talking about the struggle against this. And the reason I wanted to do this with Talal is because I want his experience of what they fought for in the 1980s for black representation in the Labour Party. And the reason that I wasn't involved in that struggle, I will say, is because I was in the Labour Party in Sheffield. And there was only a handful of us, but I can remember raising the issue of black sections and being told, you know, we are here in Sheffield, you know, the miners' strike, mass unemployment, and all of these things, of course, were absolutely true, but this is a complete diversion. And of course, all these years later, I just see that for what it represented, which was an attempt to deny Labour's role, Labour's right and proper role in the fight against racism. His bit now.